there are hundreds of bodies that can't be identified because they're not whole, or they've been burned so much that they can't. So we were really, we can be lucky. We can say, he was identified right away. He was buried on Thursday evening, and there's still a lot of people who haven't had that.
From battlefield to bomb shelter, from home front to hospital, from volunteer rosters to victims lists, women experience war in distinctive, gendered ways. These are their stories. These are their voices. Welcome to Voices of Women at Wartime, a podcast by the Center for Women's Justice. I'm Rachel Stomel.
And I'm Rivkah Lubitch.
Voices of Women at Wartime examines how women affect war and how war affects women. These are the unique perspectives and testimonies of women in their own words, a candid conversation that is sometimes hopeful, sometimes heartbreaking, but always honest and always essential. As we launch into the series, a bit of background about who we are and why we're doing this. The Center for Women's Justice is a legal advocacy organization in Israel that defends women's rights whenever they're violated by the state in the name of religion.
So how does this all tie into a podcast about women's voices in a time of war?
So now here I'd like to talk about another form of justice, and that is epistemic justice. Epistemic justice means the way we give validity and value to people's narratives. Who do we regard as credible? Whose stories do we listen to? Whose expertise do we recognize? Whose points of view do we include in our cultural conversation? Women have long suffered from epistemic injustice, meaning women's voices and stories have been dismissed as not important, not valid, or not credible. This has been the case in all sorts of areas, wartime certainly being one of them. And that's why we at the Center for Women's Justice feel that it is essential right now to dedicate this podcast series to highlighting and centering women's voices. It's an intentional feminist act, it's an important wartime act, and it's part and parcel of our vision for women's justice in Israel.
On that note, let's jump into how all of this began. We woke up Shabbat, Saturday morning on the 7th of October to a war which is changing our lives. We discovered that the kibbutzim near the border with Gaza, which we call Yishuvei Otef Aza, were attacked by thousands of Hamas terrorists, and that the people living there were fighting for their lives. Women, men, and children were murdered, and nearly 250 captives were taken to Gaza. Other cities in Israel were being bombed, and terrorists were all over the south of the country. As Rachel just said, we are here to bring you some of the voices of women in this time. Today we are speaking to Wacholder Katsman, whose son was killed at Kibbutz Holit. Chana works with us at the Center for Women's Justice, and she's a good friend. And we are following her, and I hope maybe helping her a little bit on the way. Hi, Chana.
Hi.
This is going to be a hard conversation. We're jumping into a very hard thing for you. Let's start by telling us a little bit about your son, Hayim.
Hayim was born in 1991, in October. His English birthday was October 3rd, and his Hebrew birthday was 3 days after Sukkot. So he was just turning 32. He was our first child born in Israel, about a year after we made Aliyah to Petah Tikva, right after the Gulf War. He was a Gulf War baby. He went to a national religious elementary school and Yeshiva high school. In 11th grade, he was kicked out of the high school. He had very strong views. He was always a very, one of his friends said, you just could not tell Chaim what to do. And that was certainly our experience raising him. Anyway, so Chaim expressed his views. He was no longer observant. He didn't believe in God. He declared himself an atheist. Not sure why exactly. I mean, that wasn't why they kicked him out, why they sent us home with a letter 3 days after the start of 11th grade with no warning that he couldn't come back. I'm pretty sure they didn't intend for him to stay out. They were hoping that he would bow his head and be more compliant.
Come crawling back to the school.
Come crawling back. They wanted him to make some kind of apology. Anyway, he transferred to this other school, and he did very well there. already in high school, he started taking open courses in Open University in philosophy, and they didn't let you major only in philosophy, so he added political science. He enlisted in the army. In the army, he worked in field intelligence, which they call Isuf Krabi. It wasn't the typical intelligence. It was a combat position, quite dangerous. He would take equipment on his back. They say, each unit has their own handicaps, so they have back problems, and go walk to wherever it was and just watch the horizon and just see what's happening in Palestinian areas and report on that. We believe he was involved in one particular dangerous operation because he was called up on Shabbat. He didn't deny or confirm that. So, there was a dangerous operation that happening then. Toward the end of his army service, he got approval to continue his undergraduate degree at Open University. And about a year after the army, he finished it. And then he moved down south to Holit.
I just want to add the obvious, I think, that he's very, very bright.
Right. I'll tell you, I'll tell the story now that his teacher told me. His high school teacher in the second school that he went to at Adar in Petach Tikva, she tells the story to her students every year. She's a literature teacher. She still teaches there. And when Hayim was killed, her former students reached out to her and said, "Is that the one you told us about?" They remembered his name. He had an exam in 5 points for literature, which was conducted by a teacher who came from the education ministry to conduct an oral exam in the high school. And I guess he was probably the only one. It was a small school anyway, not too many, especially boys, unfortunately, do 5 points of literature. And his regular teacher explained to me that she was very intimidated by her colleague, and her colleague merely gave high grades, and she was tough. So Hayim told her that she asked him the first question, and he started to answer. And after a sentence or two, she said, "Okay, next question." And Hayim was concerned. He didn't understand why she didn't want him to finish the question. So the same thing happened. Second question, just started to answer. "Okay, go on to the third question." Third question, the same thing. She interrupts him. She writes 100 on the paper. She hands it to him, and she says, "Keep talking. I like listening to you." So she said she couldn't understand why they kicked him out, because he was really a top student. But I think they felt he was too influential. And he, of course, was I didn't talk about his personality, except to say that he was strong-willed, but as a child, he had many, many gifts. He was extremely attractive. He was funny. He drew people to him. He knew how to talk to people. He always had a lot of friends.
He seems also like someone who thrived with independent challenges. Even if he wasn't in a certain system, he could find where he needed to go and challenge himself and build, what he needed for his next steps.
Yes, and my sister, who's a professor, pointed out that, we'll get to this later, but while he was in Holit, he was still doing research. He was still writing. And she said, if I would have been out there on my own, I wouldn't have been able to keep doing that. He had a certain drive that reminds me of my father, who was also a scholar and professor. Okay, so we moved to Holit, and I didn't remember the whole story, exactly how he got there. One of his friends from the school in Petach Tikva. So there were students from all over the Tel Aviv area who'd been kicked out of their high schools. And he became very close friends with many of them. And one of them hooked up with this garin, this literally seed of I don't know what the word that comes to mind, this pioneers, and then who would go to join this kibbutz.
Can you explain to us where Holit is? Because not everyone knows
so Holit
where it
is relatively close to the Gaza border, what we call the Gaza envelope. And there's a whole number of kibbutzim and communal settlements there.
So it's a very dangerous area.
Very dangerous.
For the last 20 years, it's been really dangerous.
Hayim's house was safe. In other words, it was secure. It was reinforced. So when there was a siren, he could just go into his house. He didn't have to run to a shelter or anything like that. But he wasn't prepared for hand-to-hand combat. He finished his first degree, his undergraduate degree, and then some friends of his were already living in Holit. As we know, housing in Israel is very difficult for young people who are just starting out. It's very expensive to rent. So a group of friends wanted to start a new community, and I don't know if Hayim was involved with that or not, but the government said no. There's a lot of communities that need reinforcement, and Holit was an aging kibbutz, and they wanted to import young people to help revive it. There's a movie where Hayim and his friends are interviewed about their experience, so that's a good source. So he went to the kibbutz. He had in the little thing about, he had a bar. He ran a bar for a while, kibbutz bar, and he had learned in high school already. He wanted to play guitar. He learned how to play guitar. When he got to Holit, this is out of order, sorry, he got a job in a garage. In the garage that serves all of the Otzet Aza of that area, in the neighboring Moshav. And he became very close with the owner, and he taught him how to repair cars, and Hayim became an expert at repairing cars.
This is after he had his doctorate in politics.
No. This is after his undergrad. This is right after the army. After the army, he was living at home. He finished his BA, and then he went to live in Holit. And that's how he supported himself. And then he started his MA in Ben Gurion in Beersheba. So he traveled to Beersheba, which is about an hour drive. And he taught there. He was also the head of the workers' union. He taught classes also.
Often, I think when we think about people who are more into academia, we don't put that together with people who are more socially involved, or people who are starting their own neighborhood bars or working as a mechanic in a garage. Like, we usually have a very sectioned off view of what people are into. And it's interesting to see this very rounded person.
So his other grandfather was a contractor, and he'd also, has rabbinic ordination. And so he got that part from that side of the family, I think. So he did his MA, and then at the funeral, his Professor Joel Migdal talked about how he taught Hayim once a week in Ben Gurion, and he became friendly with Hayim, and he was impressed with Hayim's writing and discussion, and he suggested that he do a doctorate at the University of Washington. That's really not how I remember it. I remember Hayim saying he was going to do a doctorate, and he was applying to 5 places in the United States, and his chances were low, and really didn't, because he was so young. And of course, it's not easy to get into, doctoral programs in general, but Joel wrote him the recommendation, and he was accepted to the Jackson School of International Relations, I think it's called. A lot has been written by his colleagues there about his work there. He learned Arabic, and he taught Israel studies. He really only spent about 2 years in Seattle. Also, when he was in Seattle, he taught Hebrew. He's always working. Hayim always had, made sure he handled his money very carefully, and he always, had extra jobs. Okay, anyway, so when he came back, and he was been living in Holit ever since, a couple years ago, he stopped working at the garage and became the gardener of the kibbutz. And all the time he was writing and publishing and teaching in Hadassah Academic College and in various pre-army programs. So on that day, I was here in Jerusalem. I heard sirens in the morning. I didn't turn on my phone until later in the day. What I understood happened is that before 7 in the morning, there were sirens and incoming rockets and terrorists. The neighbor, Nitzan, who came to the shiva, told me that he saw about 40 terrorists. He sent me a message that he was okay at around 7 something. I didn't hear from him after that. I know there was a woman that he spoke to on the phone all morning. She told me. I'm just piecing this together from different things that I heard.
Right, of course.
Neighbor Avital was on CNN. You can link to that also. He went to her house that was next door. She'd been living in the kibbutz, just not too long.
In the middle of all the shooting, he left the house and went to see...
No, it was quiet. At first there was shooting, and then he saw his neighbor had been killed. He saw one of the bodies of one of the neighbors, but it was quiet. The kibbutz is big, and it's a fairly big area, so there was a period where they weren't near him.
Right.
They just didn't know what was happening, and they were waiting from the texts that people have sent me, just said, the army's not here. I think the army is here. They're not here. And the neighbor, Nitzan, waited on he had a ladder and he was able to escape to his roof. He waited there for 12 hours for the army to come.
That's how he survived, by being on the
roof? He survived, and he didn't have his phone, so no one knew where he was until afterwards. So this neighbor, Avital, said that Hayim came and hid with her in the closet in her safe room. And the terrorists came and shot into the closet, and Hayim absorbed the bullets, and she only had some shrapnel on her leg. She said he died quickly, which I believe sounds accurate. Terrorists pulled her out of the closet, and then they asked her to cover herself up. This is Hamas we're talking about. And she covered herself up with 3 skirts on her legs, her shoulders, and her head. They sat her on the sofa and brought her 2 children of Adi and Anani Katsman. Adi was also murdered. The body was found a few days later. And they shot a hostage video. Then they brought her to the neighbors and told her to convince them to come out of wherever they were hiding. And they said, no kill mothers, no kill children. That's what the terrorists said. She said, I knew that wasn't true. And then they took her and the children across the fence of the kibbutz and across the border into Gaza on foot. She said she could already see the houses. And then they said to her, Leslie, go. The terrorist she was holding the baby. There was a 4-month-old baby and child almost 4 years old. The terrorist held him on his shoulders and he took him down and he said, and she went, and there were other terrorists on the way, but apparently they filmed this also. So they used her as a model.
But she was being walked into Gaza with 2 children that weren't hers because their mother was murdered and she was just holding on to these kids. And the father wasn't even there. He was somewhere else, not in the kibbutz.
That's right. That's correct. And the father survived, yes. And Avital walked back with the children on her own. She carried the baby and she made a sling out of one of the skirts, and she made it back to Holit.
Do you have his phone? Do you have a record of all his texts?
I don't have his phone yet. I know some people got calls from the terrorists.
The terrorists? Oh my God.
Yes, I did not. I know his things are intact and we'll get them eventually. But no one has told me anything about his phone at the moment. All I know is that when I called it after Shabbat, it rang.
I remember right after Shabbat, and you still didn't know what was going on.
Yeah. After Shabbat, like I said, I called him. There was no answer. I compartmentalized. I knew that if I turned on my phone in the morning, I would just, and there wouldn't be anything I could do. And, you don't think something is going to happen. You don't think it's going to me, I think that has to be my attitude. Otherwise, I would never.
So from Shabbat morning, what time did you know that something bad happened to him? Until when did you find out that he died?
I didn't know anything happened to him. Right after Shabbat, his friend Gidon, who was in elementary and high school with him and who had lived on the kibbutz, so he had contacts in the kibbutz, he called me right away, and he was hoping that I had been notified of something. Because he'd been in touch with Hayim, and since 1:15, he hadn't heard anything. He knew about Avital. I guess Avital probably told right away, but nobody really wanted to say anything to me until they, found his body. But on the other hand, I'm not sure why they said that he said he'd heard that he was kidnapped. So I don't know. I really don't know. It's not important to me, at this point. But I just want to say we were lucky in that way because we found out in the middle of the night and he was more or less intact. And there's, so many people who can't be identified because they were incinerated. I want to say this because the people who are listening are not necessarily people who are connected, who know me from other venues. This massacre was so brutal that there are hundreds of bodies that can't be identified because they're not whole or they've been burned so much that they can't So we were really, we can be lucky. We can say, he was identified right away. He was buried on Thursday evening. And there's still a lot of people who haven't had that privilege yet.
Oh, it's really a crazy perspective to have, like a hellish privilege to be able to easily identify your child.
Yes.
That's like a horrible thing to have to even.
Yes, in fact, someone from the Rivkah Kadisha, from the Burial Society, the one they don't do a regular, this is something I didn't know, that when someone is killed in an unnatural way, they don't do the regular washing of the body, and they don't undress them, and they just maybe sprinkle a little bit of water on them. And so he came and told us that, his face was clear. Hayim was recognized as a fallen soldier because he was still in the reserves, and he was part of the Kitat Kunanut, the defense group, military defense group of the kibbutz. He had been to India for 3 months. He'd just come back a couple of weeks before. I saw him right when he came back, and he had left his gun he had deposited his gun for safekeeping, and he hadn't gotten it back yet because he wanted him to keep it in some special kind of case. The army was concerned about terrorists getting hold of guns in the South. So they were putting more restrictions. I understood in some places they removed guns. Hayim was supposed to have a gun, and he didn't. As someone said, at the Shiva, bureaucracy. There's a bureaucracy. Me and Hayim's father and Hayim's friend, as who represented his friends, they felt it wasn't appropriate to have a military funeral. We didn't, so we did not. We didn't get notice about this until Wednesday. It took them a few days to decide that he would be a fallen soldier and not a terror victim. So it changed all the support the support system in place for terror victims and for families of fallen soldiers is different. There's a lot of support. A lot of some benefits also, which Hayim would say for sure take that.
One of the things I think that struck me that you mentioned at the Shiva and that I've been thinking about a lot since then was that you mentioned that he didn't wait for, everything to be perfect to start doing things, that he was constantly finding new things to do and constantly reinventing himself and challenging himself to learn more and to write more and to do more. You mentioned that like a lot of people who are doing their doctorate, for example, will put everything on hold until they finish that, do one thing at a time, finish it, and then they'll start living their life. And you mentioned Hayim, whose name means life, he was constantly just doing stuff. And that's something that I kind of been thinking about a lot, because I know I do that with myself in the other direction, that I say, when I finish this, then I'll start, after the kids are, settled here, after I finish this project, then I'll start doing the things that I want to do. And then if you live like that, you just keep pushing things off for whenever. So I'm kind of, I've been using what you said to kind of reevaluate where my own priorities are. And maybe for our listeners also, this means something. And there's something,
Yeah, while he was, but he went to Washington, and like I said, he was teaching, and he played music, and he lived with his grandfather for a while in Seattle. And when he came back, he had his field work was interviews in Israel. So he did his field work and wrote, and he also worked at the garage a couple of days a week. And he finished fairly quickly.
You've shared a bunch of Hayim's work and things that he's written about, and a lot of things that are really interesting to us. He's written about religious extremism in Israel. He's also mentioned, religious feminism. He's written about a lot of things that I think are relevant to us. And we're going to put also in the comments here some links to his work. But is there anything that you would like to bring up about his political views or his work that you think could be of interest to our listeners also?
A colleague of his sent me an article for my permission to publish. It's about the future of the Israeli left, where he compares the success of the right and the far right in getting the support of mainstream Israel for settlements. And he talked about the tactics that they use and how the left could learn from those tactics. I wasn't aware of how involved he was for the Palestinian cause. He didn't tell me. It was dangerous, perhaps.
I'm going to wrap up today's talk because we could go on for a long time listening to stories about Hayim and to what it's like to be a mother of a son who was murdered in a terrorist attack. I'm looking for the right words to say, Chana, but in the meantime, I'm just grabbing a tissue and holding onto it tight. Chana, your words were extremely powerful, and you are amazing. I think we got a taste of Hayim's character, his life, and his horrific death. Hayim was killed, but his legacy will live on. We are all trying to figure out how to stay sane these days. Many of us are looking for something to do to help in some way. I think that listening to one story of one person that could have been our friend, could have been our son, is in some way putting some order and meaning in this chaotic world that we're living in right now. Thank you to our listeners. Please pass this on to anybody you think would want to listen to this. We'll be putting some links to Hayim's scholarly work in the podcast notes that go along with this episode, so feel free to read it and learn from Hayim's insightful writing.
If you have thoughts, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on social media. Thank you, Rabbi Scott Kahn, for the recording and editing. I'd also like to give a shout out to Dr. Chana Leibovitz, who's a brilliant scholar and a CWJ supporter, for first introducing me to the concept of epistemic justice, so thank you for that.
I am Rivkah Lubitch, and I was here with Rachel Stomel. Don't forget to subscribe and share so that you can stay updated with more stories and testimonies of women at wartime. Stay safe.